Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
This is Kurt Rampenchek, your host at National Parks Traveler. There were two stories that stood out from the national parks this past week. One involved the tasing of a Native American visitor to Petroglyph National Monument who went off trail and refused to obey a ranger's orders. The other involved 9 pounds of human excrement that rangers cleaned out of the Narrows at Zion National Park. That's right, 9 pounds. As beautiful and rejuvenating as national parks can be, they also attract a measure of news that is startling, sad, disconcerting, and even alarming. How can these incidents be avoided? More rangers? More education? More respect? What are your thoughts? You can find those and other stories about national parks and protected areas at nationalparkstraveler.org. In this week's show, we're discussing the Appalachian National Scenic Trail. 2021 marks 100 years since forester and planner Benton MacKaye penned an article that conceived a trail connecting farmlands, mountain ranges, camps, and towns along the Appalachian Mountain Range. 16 years later, the Appalachian Trail was completed, traversing through 14 eastern states from Maine to Georgia for more than 2,100 miles. Each year, an estimated 3 million people take to the trail. Some folks attempt to hike the whole thing from end to end in one big trip. Some tackle chunks of it at a time in no particular order. And many are content to spend a day or two wandering through stunning mountain ridgelines and secluded white pine and hemlock forests. In honor of this anniversary, Lynn Riddick met up with one AT enthusiast who has experienced the colossal physical and mental challenges of tackling the entire trail and its immense rewards.
The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. We are park stewards to ensure our most wild and historic places remain for generations to come, to safeguard our preferred arena for adventure, reflection, and inspiration. We donate 4% of our proceeds, and that's revenues, not profits, to support America's most wild and historic places. We are Wild Tribute, apparel for the parks. Find out more at wildtribute.com. Western National Parks Association is a nonprofit education partner of the National Park Service. WNPA supports parks across the West, developing products, services, and programs that enhance the visitor experience, understanding, and appreciation of national parks. Learn more at WNPA.org.
My pace was quick. The woods around me seemed only a blur as I concentrated on placing my feet around exposed rocks and roots in the trail. With a short, cleared stretch ahead, I allowed myself to glance upward. Several yards ahead, I noticed the outline of a spider web across the trail. As I walked closer, I saw the architect and builder of the web, a large red-rumped spider, for the lack of a Latinus namus. My game plan for the hundreds of webs I had confronted to this point was to crash mercilessly through the silky blockade and let the spider beware. This time I stopped.
Those were the musings of a 22-year-old Maryland man who hiked the entire 2,190-mile Appalachian National Scenic Trail in 1980, by himself for the most part, all the way from Maine to Georgia. He journaled daily, wrote letters to friends from the trail, and submitted regular articles to the Baltimore Sun, documenting the physical challenges, the humorous encounters with other hikers, and his increasing awareness of his relationship to the natural world.
The web was not complete. The spider was building this one. I guess I had never thought about how those webs actually got there. I continued to observe. From the large outside circle, the strands that reached toward the center act as a framework for the structure. The spider was in the process of working its way around the inside, with hundreds of smaller strands, each placed one at a time, connecting two of the larger ones. While I don't mean to get too descriptive in my spider encounter, it is just an example of the life I've noticed over my long life from Maine. These observations have made me realize we are sharing this world with so much more than our cranky neighbor or the crowds at Kmart.
That hiker is Brian Hayek, who is now 62 years old. A high school era friend of mine, Brian and I met up on a windy November day in western Maryland to retrace some of his steps 40 years later. We were in the South Mountains, which is the northern extension of the Blue Ridge Mountain region of the larger Appalachian Range. The Maryland segment of the trail is 37 miles long. I was curious to talk with Brian about the experiences of a journey that not only never leave a hiker, but become part of who they are. A journey that is also equivalent to hiking up Mount Everest from sea level and back down again 16 times. Our meeting point was Reno Monument near Fox's Gap. It's one of many historical sites along the trail and a location of Civil War combat in 1862. A granite monument there commemorates the death of Union General Jesse Reno. Hi, Brian. Welcome to The Traveler.
It's great to be here, Lynn. Thanks for having me and for letting me reminisce about this old friend of mine, the Appalachian Trail.
You hiked the entire trail starting in May 1980, and you finished in October 1980. You were 22 when you finished, and you made the decision to start in Maine and finish in Georgia. Tell me what went into that decision, and also how did the whole trip come about?
The Appalachian Trail just totally fascinated me from the very first time I heard about it. I mean, I was on a church youth group hike up in Pine Grove Furnace State Park, which is in Pennsylvania, just north of here. And the youth group leader pointed in both directions on the trail and just told me that this side of the trail goes all the way to Georgia, and this side of the trail goes all the way to Maine. And I could never get that out of my head. It's like, how fascinating is that a path in the woods would go that far? From that point on, it became an intriguing thing for me that, wow, some people could actually walk that whole way. But it wasn't a thing then. I mean, it wasn't, hundreds of people weren't doing it then. It was a few select folks each year were doing it. And then a guy named Ed Garvey, who was a profound hiker in this area, he wrote a book called Appalachian Hiker, which was geared especially towards through hiking the Appalachian Trail specifically. And that became sort of like a Bible for those of us who were inspired to do this. And that initial youth group trip and combined with this book just totally fascinated me. So of course I told my mom about it. It's like, I really want to do this. And along with the aspirations for being a football player and baseball player and that kind of a thing. Okay, well you think about that, and maybe after college you can do that. Thinking I would just forget about it, but I never did. And 6 days after I graduated from the University of Maryland, I was on the Appalachian Trail, which leads into your first question, which was, why did I go north to south when south to north is by far the most popular? People like to go south to north because of the seasons. I think you can follow the warm weather a little bit more easily from south to north. I think that's debatable. But the biggest reason was because I graduated. I had to get a degree. So, I couldn't graduate from the University of Maryland until in May. And that's really a late start down in Georgia. Most people in Georgia start on April Fool's Day or before that, and I needed to, get that sheepskin. So I began to look into other options, and the north to south thing suddenly made pretty much sense. And, in retrospect, I'm really happy I did it that way, because I was never really in any kind of cold weather in Maine. The black flies were a little bit bad, but I hit the Smokies and the peak of the colors.
Although I grew up in Maryland, I had never been on the AT, as it's affectionately known. Who better than Brian to give me a guided, albeit short, tour? Tell me a little bit about this part of the trail, and
Can you describe it for me?
So the Maryland section of the Appalachian Trail was actually one of my favorites, just because the hiking was easy. We had just gotten off 200 miles of rocky ridge walking in Pennsylvania, and we got to more of a softer, cushiony trail here in Maryland. And there's just a lot of, the terrain's not bad. There's some great views. There's some really nice shelters, some springs, and a couple of really nice views from some of the rock outcroppings.
It takes quite a village to manage and maintain the AT's 2,200 miles in 14 different states. So a number of organizations have formed a cooperative management system. They include the National Park Service, the U.S. Forest Service, other federal and state agencies, the nonprofit Appalachian Trail Conservancy, and 31 volunteer-based trail maintaining clubs.
In addition to the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, which is the governing body of the whole trail, there are many trail clubs that are more localized to the states, and they do a tremendous job of maintaining their sections of the trail. I mean, this trail just doesn't stay the way it is easily, with all the storms and winters and log falls and overgrowth of brush. This trail needs a tremendous amount of maintenance, and these Appalachian Trail clubs that come out and maintain these, they put in tremendous amounts of man hours. Volunteers do, and if they didn't do what they did, we could not walk on this trail. And I just wanted to shout out to them that we're really thankful for that.
We came up to this log that's across the trail, and it's got some X's carved in. Any idea what this is?
The X's that are carved on the log are, well, it's twofold. The log is on the trail to prevent erosion. Water running down the trail will hit the log and run off to the side of the trail instead of continuing to run down the trail and create a ditch. The reason the X's are on the top of the log is that when it's wet, it's less slippery on your boots if you happen to walk on the log. Just a little extra the trail maintenance folks did to safeguard.
That's interesting. And here's a trail blaze.
Trail blazes are 6 inches high and I think usually 2 inches wide, and they're very uniform throughout the entire trail, although some blazes are fresher than others. But they should always be somewhere near being in sight of one another. So from one blaze, you should always be able to see the next blaze. Not always the case, believe me, but they try to maintain that ratio.
Brian and I hiked down to the original Rocky Run shelter along a steep hill in spring. The log shelter was built in 1940 by the Civilian Conservation Corps and was finished the following year by the Potomac Appalachian Trail Club. That club was later presided over by the aforementioned book author and trail enthusiast Ed Garvey. There are only 15 remaining shelters on the trail built by the CCC, and this is one of them.
Tell me what we're looking at right now.
We're standing at Rocky Run Shelter, which is one of about, 150, 200 three-sided rustic shelters that are placed along the Appalachian Trail for thru hikers. Not always used by just thru hikers, but that's what they're meant for. This one is Rocky Run. This is the old Rocky Run shelter. A lot of times they've been replacing shelters as they go through the years. This is one of the places where the old shelter still exists along with the new shelter because it's still in pretty decent shape. It's just pretty small, and they've been improved over the years.
Do you remember staying here?
I remember staying here many times because it's near my home. We're hanging out near the house right now. So, a lot of tune-up hikes here, a lot of through Maryland hikes that we stayed here. It's got a great spring next to it, one of the best on the whole AT. So I've stayed in the shelter many times. On my through hike in 1980, I stayed in the area, but there were people occupying the actual shelter, so I was just camped that night. But yeah, it's sort of like coming home at the Rocky Run shelter.
Do you remember what you did that night when you saw that the shelter was full? Did you just pitch your sleeping bag on the ground, or?
Well, I have a tent, and so whereas I like to stay at shelters because it provides a lot more room to roam around, and it's under cover. You got a roof over your head. Plus, the other thing is that the Appalachian Trail is such a social experience that a lot of times other thru hikers would also be stopping here, and you could look in each other's guidebooks and like tell each other what's ahead for each other, and it was sort of a gathering as well. One of the coolest things I brought, which I still have, is the Appalachian Trail data book from 1980, which is a sort of a collapsed, condensed version of all the points like road crossings and peaks and gaps and places like where shelters are and springs, and it's all compiled by miles where these things are. This is like really what I use the most every day and where I wanted to be and how. So like for instance, when we cross the Susquehanna River, then there's a tenth of a mile later is the Juniata River crossing, and then a mile later is Duncannon, Pennsylvania, which is a trail town. So folks would get into my data book and they would write, people who have come from the south and knew where I was going, they would write like, okay, well, the fireman's basement in Duncannon is open to hikers. So they would write that in there. So I would have that. And then another 0.7 of a mile was another road crossing. And then another mile after that at 3.1 is Hawk Rock, which is a vista on the Appalachian Trail. So I'd be able to like plan all these mileages, how far I wanted to get. At 4.9 is Thelma Marks Memorial Shelter. So I would know there was a shelter in 5 miles from the Susquehanna River. And this went on, this book includes mileages all the way down from Maine to Georgia. So this was something I used not only every day, but like multiple times every day, and knowing where I was and knowing where I wanted to go.
Next stop was the Rocky Run Spring, adjacent to the old shelter.
No, I'm not going to the bathroom. This is an outstanding spring on the Appalachian Trail. A lot of times, the Appalachian Trail goes over ridgetops, and therefore it's not as, the water is not as frequent as sometimes we might like, but every once in a while there's an advertised spring, and this is one of the best. This would fill your canteen up. This would fill a liter bottle up in about 8-10 seconds. So always welcome when you see H2O on
Now
the
it's a
trail.
little suspicious because I see the spring coming out of the rock, but then there's a 4-foot length of PVC pipe where the water is coming from the creek over some rocks. Is that a concern at all? Do you remember that being here?
When I was through hiking, we didn't have a lot of this PVC stuff. This has been installed later by like Boy Scout troops or other trail maintenance clubs to, I guess, make it easier to fill your bottles up. If you're talking about bacteria type concerns, because the pipe is not exactly the cleanest looking thing in the world, that's never really a concern. But the thing is that you're always purifying or treating water anyway, which is also a more recent practice. When I hiked the trail in 1980, unbelievably, I treated water twice in 6 months, in 5.5 months. So I don't know whether more beavers are pooping in the streams lately, but Giardia and other microorganisms are certainly a concern, and it's certainly worth the time to purify or treat your water. But it wasn't really a thing back in 1980, and I never got sick. So maybe I'm lucky. I don't know exactly what to attribute that to, but it made it a little easier because I just dipped out of streams and just drank.
We made our way back up the hill to a newer shelter.
So right now we're in the newer Rocky Run shelter, which is really just about a mile off of a roadway. Basically for maintenance purposes, it's easier to maintain. But this is a much bigger, more modern shelter. And when I say modern, we're talking like it was probably built in around the early 2000s. I mean, it's still probably 15, 20 years old, but it's much bigger. It can fit many more hikers. It's got a picnic table with a roof over the head, whereas the older shelter that we just looked at just was basically just a small bunk. And it's got benches. It's got usually a nice fire pit outside. Sometimes the fire pits are even sort of have a partial roof over them, which is really great too. And there's also a lot of campsites nearby, just in case in the busy thru-hiker season, which in Maryland is around the end of May, beginning of June, there's a lot of overflow. So people can camp nearby and still make use of the shelter for food restuffing and the picnic table and stuff like that.
So it's got a kind of a cool loft. Four rungs on a ladder that go up to a loft.
It's basically done that way just to add bunk space. Instead of just having one floor, now you've got a little ladder up to a completely second floor where you can probably fit 5 or 6 more other campers. It gets crowded, no doubt about it, and there's always some snorers and people who stay up later than others, but the Appalachian Trail hiking community is a pretty amazing group of hikers who come from so many diverse backgrounds and reasons why they're doing this, but they all sort of come together, and there's a really good camaraderie as this little pod of hikers moves up the coast from most of the way south to north.
There's so much information out there now, so many books, so much online, and really there wasn't I shouldn't say there wasn't a whole lot, but your options for information were limited 40 years ago. So what went into the preparation of your trip?
Well, I wish I had a really nice long answer for you on that one, Lynn. But I didn't really have as much preparation as you would think. I mean, I was not an avid backpacker by the time I attempted this trek. One of my best friends, Roman Marecki, at the time, was a pretty avid backpacker. And so we sort of got together with this little Appalachian Trail dream. And so we sort of took some tune-up hikes earlier that spring. And, you're right. There wasn't a lot of preparation information out there. So we made a lot of mistakes in the way we prepared. I mean, just one example, we took this ridiculous poncho that had allowances for going over your pack in the back, and it snapped on the sides, and it was ridiculous. It was just the slightest amount of wind, you just became a sail, and it didn't keep out any rain, and it was just ridiculous. It was a bad mistake, and I shipped it back home before too long. I read the book that Ed Garvey wrote front and back 8 times, just because he also provided an account of the actual trip itself, as well as how to prepare for it. So I really tried to go by the things that he was talking about having on hand, as far as your gear, your sleeping, your clothes. We really almost just learned by trial by fire. I wasn't really, to be honest, that prepared for this trip. But when you're 22 years old and fairly healthy, you get to be fairly resilient. And here's another important part about the Appalachian Trail. It's somewhat of a forgiving path. When you're talking about long trails and you're comparing it to like the Pacific Crest Trail or the Continental Divide Trail, those traverse much more larger areas of wilderness with higher elevations and lower elevations, and the Appalachian Trail is almost a social footpath. I mean, it goes from Maine to Georgia, but it traverses so many populated areas and parks and towns. There are several towns that goes right through the main street, and you can always stop and you can always buy things and you can always ship things back to your home. And so, in that regard, I think it was a good hike to take because we were able to adapt as we went along.
You had a setback early in the hike. Your friend Roman got an injury. Take us back to that moment in time and what you were thinking at that point.
Well, the Appalachian Trail has some easy parts and it has some tough parts. One of the tough for me and obviously for Roman, the toughest part for me was a 30 to 40 mile stretch of mountains right at the southern end of Maine called the Mahoosucs. Basically, there are no switchbacks. You're just going straight up and straight down 3,000 and 4,000 foot mountains. It's pretty unrelenting. And Roman, throughout that time, had some Achilles problems with his boot. I'm not exactly sure even to this day, what caused his foot problem, but he had to take his boots off and use tennis shoes in some of the worst parts. And we got to Gorham, New Hampshire, which is just north of the White Mountains. And he got a ride into a clinic at that point. And he came back and he said his trip was over. And not only was his trip over, but he really shouldn't even be standing up. So the next morning, Roman took a bus back from Gorham, New Hampshire. And in the meantime, we had to completely change our gear around because we were sharing all of our stuff. So we had to completely gear up for me to go on by myself, which was never not an option, frankly. I mean, even though Roman was the most experienced hiker and I was pretty unexperienced, we had put in about 3 or 4 weeks now, and I just, it wasn't, I had to go on, and Roman wouldn't have stood for anything less. Not to mention the fact I was writing a series for the Baltimore Sun at the time. I was a journalism major in Maryland, so I was able to write a series where I actually wrote stories for the Baltimore Sun from the trail, and they printed them as I was walking with my own photographs, and it was, I couldn't say, okay, folks, well, Roman's stopping, so I am too.
Well, I want to ask you a little bit more about that. So when Roman got injured and was tapping out, you resolved to do it on your own. Were you afraid? You did the rest of the trail, which was, 5 months worth by yourself. How did that go?
Well, Roman and I were best friends, and it was difficult. This was meant to be a hike that we were going to do together, and that this was sort of our dream. So that was very difficult on a number of levels to make that departure because, his side of that dream was going to be a little bit short, was not going to happen. So I felt just horrible about that. And I also, to be honest, was a little bit apprehensive about my ability to take this on all by myself because it was never meant to be all by myself. So it was very difficult to continue on, especially because ahead of me lurked probably some of the toughest hiking on the whole trail with Mount Washington and that whole presidential range, which has some of the worst weather in America. So it was a difficult thing to go on, but I don't think it was ever a decision. It was something that we both wanted me to do, not just me.
Now, your trip was a long time ago, although you've been back to the Appalachian Trail many times for day trips or maybe some overnight trips. But your 40-year-ago trip was well documented. You snail-mailed articles on a regular basis to the Baltimore Sun. You wrote letters to friends, including me, and you kept a journal, which you estimate to be
90,000 words. I mean, I counted the words on one page, and then I multiplied it by that many pages. I think it's about that. I wrote every night in my in the shelter or wherever I was camped about the day's events. And I'm just so happy I did that because, and it's like the size of a book. I mean, I don't know if it's a book anybody would want to read because I did a lot of complaining and things like that, but it was basically written in the form of a letter to my parents. That's basically how it was written. But it was, I've been reading it this month just because it's been this anniversary, and I wanted to sort of just rehash some of the things that went on. And I'm just so glad I did it because everything comes back even though it was 40 years ago. Everything comes back, and you're almost like you're walking it again in some ways. Well, there was one time where we were totally out of water, and it was 103 degrees in Connecticut, and we were just almost on our knees trying to find water. And we came to a road crossing, and about a quarter mile up from the crossing was a restaurant. And so whereas I was almost, in a dire situation with my hydration, 15 minutes later I was ordering Peking duck, and there was some person who was in charge of keeping our water glasses full, and they just pretty much stood by our table the whole time. And it was just sort of odd twist of events when you're on the Appalachian Trail.
I'm Lynn Riddick, and I'll have more with Brian Hayek, avid backpacker and AT alum, after this short break.
Listener and reader support make National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation via nationalparkstraveler.org. The Grand Teton National Park Foundation is a private, nonprofit organization that supports projects that protect and enhance Grand Teton National Park's cultural, historic, and natural resources. By funding initiatives that go beyond what the National Park Service could accomplish on its own, Foundation donors improve the visitor experience and provide benefits to the National Park System for decades to come. See their successes at gtnpf.org. Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It is also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. The North Cascades Institute has a large portfolio. It is an environmental learning center, training center, conference center, and leadership center, all set in the splendor of the North Cascades National Park Complex. Learn more at ncascades.org. Washington State is graced with 3 spectacular national parks, each different and special in their own unique ways. As the official nonprofit partner and the only philanthropic organization dedicated exclusively to supporting these parks through charitable contributions, Washington's National Park Fund has a mission to deepen the public's love for, understanding of, and experiences in Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. Share your passion for these parks at wnpf.org.
I'm back with Brian Hayek and more of his adventures on the Appalachian Trail.
How did you get the Baltimore Sun to run your stories?
So I worked on the Baltimore Sun copy desk as an intern the year before that, as part of my journalism coursework at the University of Maryland, and I just pitched it to them as I was leaving that internship that summer before. I said, I'm thinking about doing this, and I think it would be novel to have just someone write this while they were walking, and they latched onto it, and it really turned out to be a successful series. I was really happy about it. I wrote articles from the trail. I included some of my fancy Instamatic photos that were pretty bad, but they still published them, and because they were from me, and they actually tracked me on a map the entire way. Each article there was like a little graphic with a little arrow pointing to where I was. And And believe it or not, I don't know how I pulled this off, but they actually put my finishing article on the front page of the Baltimore Sun on November 1st or 2nd of 1980.
You had probably amassed quite a following at that point. Baltimore Sun readers were probably following your story, and
it was a pretty popular. It was a pretty popular series from what I heard, and lots of people were talking to me about it. I was like a mini celebrity for a little while, which was sort of odd. And when I got back, I was actually on a couple of radio shows where they were asking me questions, and people were calling in and asking questions, and it was kind of surreal because I'm not really a celebrity. I just walked a little ways.
so you were hiking alone, and you mentioned how the Appalachian Trail is a real social trail. People are very friendly that you see. How important was it that you had some contact with other hikers as you were going along? And was there a stretch of days you didn't see anybody?
Well, it's kind of funny because when you're going south to north with everyone else, you're sort of like a traveling community that's walking together, and you create probably much stronger bonds. And one thing we haven't gotten into, but everyone seems to have a trail name, which even back in 1980, there were trail names. Now it's like if you don't have one, everyone has trail names. I never had a trail name.
What would your trail name be?
And I don't know. Well, usually they other people sometimes give it to you because of a weird habit or a hometown food you like. I mean, it comes a lot. They come about in a lot of weird ways. But I never had a trail name, and I'm not. I even wrote an article about that. I'm just Brian hiking on the trail. But there's this community going south to north of hikers, and it's great. I mean, for me, I got to talk to a lot of people, but I'm going north to south, and I was one of the only people who did it that summer. And so I'm meeting people going the other direction. And so I'm not, unless we happen to be at the same shelter where we can talk about what's ahead for each person, I really didn't have these like long-lasting relationships with people. I was sort of like more like the 15-minute conversation, and I'm on my way. But I was a very valuable commodity for those who were going south to north, because for many of them, I was the first person they met who could tell them what was ahead of them all the way up to Maine. And I became very popular for that reason, just because they wanted info, the 411 on what was ahead of them, as far as not just mountains and climbs and things like that, but also like what stores were open at what times, and what little trail magic, what little trail magic surprises were ahead.
Did you have any best days? Did you have any worst days?
Yeah. Best days and worst days. The answer is definitely yes. There are times you've felt really up, and there are times you felt really down, which is funny because most of these good days, bad days were because of just my mental state, more so than a physical thing. I mean, I had some foot ailments, nothing major. One of my boots was acting up, and it was causing some problems. But the physical things weren't really the problem so much as the isolation of hiking by yourself, and some of the creature comforts that you miss, such as a hot shower or contact with your friends and family. Probably, my best days were probably when I was like reading letters in a town where I went to a post office, and I'd get a box with brownies from my mom and letters from friends, and of course when you reach the top of a mountain, or you get to lunch at a great spot where there's a stream and an idyllic camping spot. I mean, all those things are certainly uplifting as well. The downsides were usually just before I got to a town or something where I stopped, and I'd just be a total crudball, and I just needed a shower so bad, and I know I didn't really have a great odor. that didn't make me feel too great. And, I had some ailments, and if I hadn't really talked with anybody in a while, or if it was raining, I'm not a big rain walker, so walking more than 2 days in the rain was sort of depressing because nothing gets dry. Fortunately, I think it was a really dry summer that summer, and I think there were only like 19 total days where it like rained all day out of the entire 5.5 months. And that included 5 consecutive days right before I finished in Georgia. And I remember laying in my tent singing A Rainy Night in Georgia vividly, because it was just 5 days of just continuous rain, and it plays with your head, man. You just like, is the sun ever going to come out? So those were some down times, but I tried to keep an even keel as much as I could.
So I want you to read an excerpt from a letter that you sent me, so go for it. Here it is.
Okay, so this is in July sometime. I haven't had time to write anyone in 2 weeks, so I've got some writing ahead of me. I have really been down in the dumps, though, through Connecticut and Massachusetts and especially New York. I'm on the Hudson now. Some really interesting things happened out here, Lynn. About a week ago, I paid $15 for essentially just a shower. The really funny thing was I probably would have paid $30. I never felt so cruddy in my life, and I felt like there was peanut butter in my beard. But last night I stayed in a monastery of all places and got fed 2 huge meals, got my own room, bathroom, shower, and even laundry machines for nothing, free. Wow, that was great. This morning I ate for an hour and a half straight. Try it sometime.
Do you remember anything else about that monastery? Do you know what it was?
It was called the Graymore Monastery. I remember everything about that because that was a highlight of all the thru hikers. There was a monastery in New York called Graymore Monastery, and for whatever reason, they catered to thru hikers. They would give you your own room, shower, laundry facilities, 2 meals, and for nothing. And you really weren't even obliged for any kind of religious activities except to be respectful. And it was just because you write in these journals in these shelters and you write about what's ahead and Graymore Monastery was like people were looking forward to this for like weeks. And so I certainly remember that very well. I also remember the $15 shower because I have never felt dirtier and cruddier than I did when I went up to that door of that hostel in Connecticut. It was I had to have a shower. It was like, I don't know if you've ever felt like that, but it was like if I didn't have a shower, I don't know what I would have done.
What's interesting about the Appalachian Trail is that it offers a seemingly endless lesson in history. And history generally makes more sense when we are older. Have you come to appreciate the history of some of the parks and monuments and places of significance that you passed through?
Well, sure. I mean, a lot of these things are very small. Like I remember in Bennington, Vermont, I was just wandering after my hiking day was over in the town of Bennington, Vermont, and all of a sudden I came upon Robert Frost's grave, and I thought, wow, I know him. There's some bigger historical monuments along the trail, and then what I thought was really intriguing was some of the smaller like gravestones of like settlers or people who were just in logging camps that their family has a little cemetery nearby. You just wonder what life was like in some of those like logging camps and mining camps. And of course, in this area we have a rich history of the Civil War. Even where we are sitting right now is near Fox's Gap, which is where a Civil War skirmish took place, I think maybe just before Antietam. So, yes, history, especially on the Appalachian Trail, which is the East Coast, where there's a lot more going on as far as history goes. There's much to be learned as you traverse from Maine to Georgia.
So you live very close to where we are right now, visiting, talking in this shelter. How often do you get out to the trail, and what's it feel like?
I've been blessed with the fact that I can still backpack. Everyone can do the math. If I graduated in 1980 and it was a 40-year anniversary, then, I'm not a spring chicken anymore. But I am able to still get out and walk and backpack and sleep on the ground and do the things that, I love to do. So, yeah, I love getting out here, not just in this area, but in the north, like in the, up in the central Pennsylvania has some great backpacking trails. And out west, which is just an amazing place, to walk and get out away from the grid. I still love to do it, and I'm just happy that I can.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what's the most common question people ask you when they find out that you've done the trail?
It's almost always, how long did it take you? How much did your pack weigh? And how many bears did you see?
How many bears did you see?
Not many, Lynn. They're always forecast, but the only real bears I saw were in the Smokies, where they actually, at least at the time I hiked, they had like chain link fence in front of the shelters where you're actually, separated from bears by chain link. Which is kind of ironic because it's almost like you're in the zoo then, because you're the one in the cage, and they're the ones roaming around outside. And we got a visit one night from a mama and her cub looking for scraps, which was pretty cool because I'd gone 4.5 months at that point. And I still hadn't seen a bear. A lot of rattlesnakes though, which actually scare me more than bears do because. I'm afraid I'm going to surprise one at some point.
So you and I are friends and we go way back. And I recall sharing a beer with you when you had just returned home. And in the course of our conversation, if my memory isn't foggy, which it could be, you told me that you were miserable about 60% of the time. So my question, has time made the misery factor fade?
I was miserable in the fact that the Appalachian Trail physically is something that, a healthy person will adapt to. I mean, by the time I was 3 or 4 weeks in, I could climb any mountain and I could go 15, 20 miles a day like any other thru hiker. It's just something that happens. And if you want to finish the trail, you need to put up those kind of miles every day to do it when you're not in cold weather. Therefore, it becomes a mental challenge, and that's where a lot of them. And miserable is a kind of a harsh word, but that's where the tough part of the trail comes in because you don't really have days off. You can take a zero, as they call it, every once in a while, or you can have a short day every once in a while. But this is a 7-day-a-week endeavor. And you are putting on your boots and you are putting on that pack and you are, cooking your breakfast and leaving that shelter every morning. And you've got about 15, 20 miles to go. And you do it day after day after day after day. And most of the time you're doing it by yourself and you're talking to yourself. And therefore it became a mental challenge more than anything else. And I think maybe that's where some of that misery, as I may have phrased it, came in, is the fact that I'd proved I could hike long distances, and it just became this endurance test. And, I would highly recommend people take as much time as they can in planning a trip like this because you want to be able to go out to that side trail and look at that vista. You want to maybe spend a little longer at that pond or that stream. And a lot of times we get obsessed with progress. How far can I get today? How far can I get tomorrow and by Thursday or Friday or Saturday? And I think that kind of tarnishes the overall experience a little bit if you're not careful. So I think maybe that was what I was talking about, Lynn.
In her 2010 book, Becoming Odessa, Epic Adventures on the Appalachian Trail, the author Jennifer Farr Davis noted that while she was on her solo hike, just after she had graduated from college, she encountered an overwhelming number of other thru hikers who were also recent college graduates. So she thought, well, that's easy to understand because most of these people, they don't have jobs yet, they don't have families, and it's easy for them to get away for 5-6 months. And then it dawned on her, she writes in her book that she says, quote, more than that, I think college grads are called to the trail because we have a lot of figuring out to do. We've spent our entire lives under the influence of family, school, and religion, and we need to test our doctrines. The trail provides a place to sort through the fact and fiction of our childhoods, end quote. So did you do any sorting or assessing the influences of your young life?
Yeah, that's a lot of fancy language, and I'd like to be able to give you a nice deep answer on this one, Lynn, as far as, I just needed some time to get myself together for a career and that kind of a thing, or maybe I was having a lot of people have a lot of deep reasons why they do this trail. I did not have deep reasons. I was fascinated by a footpath that stretched 2,100 miles, and as I came to like backpacking, it just seemed to be a goal, a challenge that I felt like was my own, and that I could take on and achieve it. I'm a kind of a goal guy, and this was just fascinating to me. And this was the time frame after college that was really the only real time I could think I could do it, because once you get into a job and a career and a family, and as I found out, I mean, you can't take 6 months out of your life and do something like this. And in reality, it was difficult to even do it when I did it, because here I was, a journalism graduate along with 9 million other journalism graduates looking for jobs right out of school, and I was going to be 6 months late. But this was something that was something that I really wanted, and my parents, bless their hearts, they were on board with it, and I took it on, and that's why I was out there, Lynn.
So what advice would the 62-year-old Brian give the 22-year-old?
They had to do the math, didn't you?
Yeah, what advice would the 62-year-old Brian give the 22-year-old Brian about hiking the trail?
Well, I think I talked about it a little bit earlier. I think give yourself as much time as you can. I think would be one of the biggest reasons, or one of the biggest pieces of advice. The other thing I would say is find friendships along the trail, but be flexible enough that if your hiking pace or your personalities or trail idiosyncrasies don't mesh, that you are also independent enough that you can also walk on your own. And now in this day and age, I mean, the 62-year-old Brian didn't have a lot of technology that's available to the 22-year-old Brian. So I would take advantage of a lot of the safety and comfort options that are out there as far as gear and communications and even food options.
So your advice is not going on deaf ears. You have a son who is in college, and he has grown to share your passion for hiking. Tell me about what you guys do. You recently did the hike of the John Muir Trail.
A lot of folks my age are not able to do, the multi-day trips anymore. I'm sort of running out of friends for that. So fortunately, my son, who is now 19, he, of course, I gave him a pretty high recommendation about backpacking. And we went out when we were little, and he was little, and he's loved it. And so he's one of the people I backpack the most with now. And of course, I have my 62-year-old uphill speed, and he needs to wait for me at times. but I can still make the hills and I can still do the miles when I need to. Now it's more like 8 to 10 miles a day rather than 15 to 20. But we really enjoy it together, which is just, I can't even tell you how much that means to me, that my son can do this with me. And that was capped off, as you said, Lynn, by our additional conquest of hiking the John Muir Trail, which I would also recommend anyone who is a backpacker to take on, because it's some of the most beautiful country in the country. And it's a 220-mile stretch from Yosemite National Park to Mount Whitney, which is the highest elevation in the contiguous USA. And he and I mean, for me, this was probably because of my age, perhaps, and the fact of the kind of terrain. This was probably to me a bigger goal and a bigger accomplishment than even the Appalachian Trail, because it was just an amazing trip. We did it in about 3.5 weeks over 2 summers because of the permits were tough. But standing on top of Mount Whitney at the end of that thing with my son, 14,500 feet up, was probably one of the highlights of my life.
So when you talk to people and they ask you why you hike the Appalachian Trail, what do you tell them? What's out here for you?
Well, I don't know if this is a 40-year thing or whether it's just a general thing, but I just like being out in the woods and hiking on trails. And it doesn't have to be the Appalachian Trail or the Appalachian Trail or any other trail. It could be, it can be any trail. I just think trails themselves present an opportunity that is fleeting the more and more time goes on, and that's just being able to get away, unplug, and enjoy the outdoors without a lot of outside interference and noise and stuff like that. It's just so nice to be able to just walk through the woods. It sounds simple. It is simple, but I just think it's a gift that we all can take advantage of, and I will always feel a little bit more at home in the woods because of my trip on the Appalachian Trail.
Well, Brian, it's been great talking with you and reminiscing, and I wish you a happy AT anniversary. And
it actually just passed about a week ago, but I actually coerced my wife into taking a picture of me in my kitchen. How pathetic is this? With my the shirt I finished the trail on and the actual pack, which I still have on my back in the kitchen. So that's kind of sad, but
I think there's a lot to be said. I think there's a lot to be said that you can still fit into your shirt.
Yeah, I don't know. You mentioned I could still button my shirt. I don't know if the buttoning part is going to be possible, but it did go over me, so that part was good.
Anyway, it's been great talking with you. And
you too, Lynn. Nice to catch up, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about the trail, and hopefully a lot of other folks will, be able to enjoy it for a long, long, long time.
That's our year opening show for 2021. We hope you enjoyed it and hope you get a chance to sample at least a few miles of the Appalachian Trail this year. Next week, we'll be taking a look at endangered and threatened species that call the National Park System home and the legal battles that swing to and fro over gaining them Endangered Species Act protections. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Rebenchek.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast series is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.